I never expected that one summer at my aunt's house would change me. It wasn't the quiet town, or even the memories tied to that place, it was her neighbor. The way she smiled, the way she said, "You've got her spirit, you know." Those words stayed with me, stirring something I didn't yet understand. The summer I turned 23, I arrived at my aunt's home with nothing more than a backpack and a need for quiet. The city had worn me down, the endless noise, the constant rush, the way each day blurred into the next. My aunt's little house, tucked away on a sleepy street lined with maple trees and flower beds, felt like a world apart. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I stepped out of the cab, and I inhaled the first breath of clean, floral air I'd tasted in months. It smelled of roses, sun-warmed wood, and something faintly sweet that I couldn't place yet. I had barely set my bag down inside before the pull of the evening light drew me back out onto the porch. That was when I noticed her. My aunt's neighbor. She was kneeling in her garden just across the fence, sleeves rolled up, her hands working gently through the soil. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot at the nape of her neck, strands escaping to catch the sunlight. She moved with an easy grace, not hurried, not striving, just present in the moment. I should have looked away. She was older than me, clearly, yet there was something about her that caught me before I could. I told myself I was only watching the way she worked, the careful patience of her hands pressing new roots into the earth, the way she brushed her cheek with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of soil. But then she looked up. Our eyes met, hers a quiet hazel, deep and steady, and for one stretched second, neither of us looked away. Her lips curved into the smallest smile, so subtle it might have been mistaken for politeness, but it reached her eyes in a way that disarmed me. It was not the kind of smile you give a stranger on the street. It was warmer, as if she already knew something about me I hadn't said. The sound of my aunt calling from inside broke the moment. I shifted my gaze quickly, pretending to study the porch rail, but the impression of her lingered like sunlight on the skin after you've stepped back into shade. My chest felt oddly full, as though something had quietly shifted inside me. I told myself she was just a neighbor, nothing more. Still, when I carried my bag upstairs later that evening, I couldn't help but glance through the window toward that garden, half expecting to catch her eyes again. The next afternoon, my aunt insisted on walking me over to meet her neighbor properly. I told myself it was nothing, just a polite introduction, the kind of small-town courtesy that came with being new in the neighborhood. But as we crossed the lawn and I spotted her again, this time standing at her gate with a basket of freshly cut lavender, I felt that same unexpected stir in my chest. She greeted my aunt first, her voice low and warm, carrying the kind of calm you don't often find in people who rush through life. Then her gaze turned to me. For a moment, she simply studied me, as though weighing something silently. And then she smiled again, that same quiet, knowing smile I'd seen the night before. My aunt introduced me by name, explaining that I was staying for the summer. Before I could say much, the neighbor tilted her head slightly and said, "You've got her spirit, you know." The words landed in me heavier than they should have. She wasn't speaking casually. Her tone was soft, almost thoughtful, as though she had recognized something familiar in me. My aunt laughed lightly, brushing the comment aside, but I stood there, struck silent. When she extended her hand, I took it, expecting a quick shake. But her palm was warm, her touch firm without being rushed. For a breath longer than necessary, her fingertips lingered against mine before she drew away. It was nothing overt, nothing anyone else would notice, but I felt it. That faint brush, deliberate or not, left my skin alive in its wake. We exchanged a few polite words, where I had come from, what I was studying, how long I would be visiting. She listened intently, her eyes never darting away or glazing over. When she laughed, it wasn't the distracted kind, but one that carried weight, as if she found genuine amusement in the smallest details. The whole exchange could not have lasted more than 5 minutes, yet I walked back with my aunt as though I'd been through something quietly significant. I couldn't shake her words, "You've got her spirit." What did she mean? Was it a reflection of my aunt's liveliness, her warmth? Or was it something more personal, something she saw in me directly? That evening, long after the house grew still, I found myself replaying that smile, that tone of voice, that touch. And the thought pressed quietly at the edges of my mind: she hadn't spoken as though I were just a boy. She'd spoken as though I were someone she had been waiting to notice. The days settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings were for long walks with my aunt, afternoons often passed in the hush of her little house, and evenings became something else entirely. It started innocently enough. My aunt would sometimes invite her neighbor over after supper, or the neighbor would wave us across the fence and insist we come sit a while. At first, I lingered on the edges of their conversations, listening as they talked about gardens and old friends, about the town's history and the neighbors who had come and gone. But soon, without meaning to, I found myself part of it, and then, slowly, I realized that more often than not, it was just the two of us left when the night grew late. Her porch became our place. We would sit across from each other in creaking rocking chairs, the summer air warm against our skin, cicadas buzzing like a faint orchestra in the trees. A pitcher of iced tea sat between us, and the glass would bead with condensation, dripping cold trails down my fingers when I lifted it. She noticed once and passed me a napkin with a small smile, her fingers brushing mine in the exchange. The touch was fleeting, accidental perhaps, but it made me acutely aware of how close she was sitting. Our talk stretched easily, wandering from books to travels, from music to memories we hadn't shared with anyone else in a long while. She spoke with a kind of clarity, like every word mattered. When she laughed, it wasn't the polite, practiced kind I often heard in the city, it was deeper, warmer, as if it surprised even her. I began to look forward to drawing that sound from her, to being the reason for that spark in her voice. There were moments when silence slipped in between us, but they never felt empty. Instead, the pauses carried weight, a quiet understanding that something was unfolding, even if neither of us dared to name it. Once, as she passed me a fresh glass of tea, her fingertips grazed the back of my hand. She didn't pull away immediately, and for a heartbeat, it felt like we were both aware of something fragile and unspoken resting between us. By the time my aunt would call me back inside, I always left reluctantly, glancing once more at her as she sat there in the soft porch light. Each night, it became harder to ignore, the comfort I found in her company was different, deeper. Something was taking root, just as surely as the flowers she tended across the fence. One evening, the air was heavy with the scent of lavender and rain still clinging to the earth. We sat as we often did, the rocking chairs creaking softly, the night humming with its quiet chorus. But her mood felt different. She wasn't leaning back as usual, relaxed with a glass in hand. Instead, she sat forward, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the dark line of the garden. I asked her a simple question, something about the book she was reading, and she smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice lower than I had ever heard it. "You know, sometimes I wonder what people think, seeing me out here talking with you every night. You must have noticed the age difference." The word startled me more than I let on. Until then, I had been careful not to frame what we had in those terms. To me, it was connection, effortless and rare. But now, under the porch light, she looked vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. She twisted the thin silver ring on her finger, her shoulders curling slightly inward. "I don't mean to sound foolish," she continued, "but there are days when I feel out of place. Like maybe I should keep my distance. You're young. You have a whole life ahead of you. And she trailed off, shaking her head with a soft laugh that wasn't really laughter at all. I didn't know how to answer. My throat felt tight, my mind racing through words I couldn't quite form. I wanted to tell her that her presence steadied me in a way no one else's had. That her wisdom didn't make her distant, it drew me closer. That the hours I spent with her had already become the brightest part of my summer. But I couldn't say any of it, not yet. Instead, I leaned forward a little, resting my hand lightly on the armrest of her chair. My fingers didn't quite touch hers, but they hovered close, an unspoken reassurance. She noticed, I think, her gaze flicked down for just a moment before she looked away. The silence between us stretched, filled with the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I wanted so badly to bridge that space, to take her hand and tell her what I felt building inside me. But all I managed was a quiet, "I don't see you that way. Not like you think." She exhaled, the sound caught somewhere between relief and doubt, and though nothing more was said, the air around us felt heavier, charged with truths that both of us were still afraid to speak aloud. The day the storm rolled in, the sky had been warning us for hours. The air grew heavy, thick with humidity, and the leaves trembled at the edge of every sudden gust. By the time evening came, dark clouds had gathered like an army above the neighborhood. I was already on her porch when the first drops began to fall, sharp and fast against the wooden steps. Within minutes, the rain was pounding in sheets, the world outside vanishing into a blur of silver. We stood side by side under the porch roof, close enough that our shoulders brushed whenever either of us shifted. The air smelled of wet earth and lavender, rain mist drifting in to cool our skin. The storm drowned out everything else, leaving only the steady roar of water and the shallow rhythm of our breathing. At one point, she turned to look at me, and I caught the damp strands of hair clinging to her cheek. Without thinking, she reached up, brushing back the wet locks that had fallen into my eyes. Her fingers lingered just long enough for me to feel the warmth of her touch against the coolness of the rain. It was the simplest gesture, but it sent a quiet shiver through me. She laughed then, a soft, genuine sound that cut through the storm. "You're drenched," she teased, though she wasn't much better herself. Drops of water clung to her lashes, her blouse darkened at the shoulders, her skin shining faintly in the low light. I couldn't help but smile, struck by how beautiful she looked in that unguarded moment. We stayed there, not speaking for a while, just watching the storm wash the world clean. I was aware of everything, the closeness of her arm against mine, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the rain, the way her laughter still seemed to hang in the air between us. It felt as though the storm had drawn us into our own small world, tucked safely beneath that porch roof, separate from everything else. At one point, a crack of thunder startled her, and instinctively she stepped closer. The brush of her shoulder pressed more firmly against mine, and for a heartbeat neither of us moved. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to stay steady, to let the moment hold without breaking it. When the thunder faded and she eased back, her hand remained on the porch railing, close enough that I could feel its warmth even without touching it. And though the rain still poured, I knew something had shifted between us, something subtle, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The storm finally passed, but the air carried its weight long after. That evening, she invited me inside, insisting I'd catch cold if I stayed out any longer. Her living room was softly lit, a single lamp glowing in the corner, and the faint scent of chamomile and rain drifted through the open windows. She handed me a towel and then disappeared briefly into the kitchen, returning with 2 steaming mugs of tea. We sat opposite each other, though the space felt smaller than it had on the porch. The rain still tapped against the windows, gentler now, and the flicker of a candle on the table between us gave the room a kind of hushed intimacy. I found myself watching her more than I should have, tracing the way the light danced across her cheekbones, the curve of her lips as she lifted her cup. Our conversation moved slower than usual, the words fewer, the silences heavier. She asked about my studies, and I answered, though my thoughts weren't on the subjects at all. She told me a story from her travels years ago, her voice softening as if she were carrying herself back there. I listened, but more than the story, I heard the subtle quiver beneath her tone. Then, after a pause, she set her mug down carefully, fingers lingering on the rim. She looked at me, really looked, and there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a mixture of courage and hesitation. Sometimes I don't know what to make of this," she began, her voice quiet, almost swallowed by the storm outside. My chest tightened. I leaned forward slightly, every nerve alert, waiting for the rest. "When you're here, when we sit like this, it feels different." She let out a faint laugh, shaking her head. "And maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe it's nothing." I don't want you to think, she broke off, biting her lip, her eyes darting away. The words hung there, unfinished, pressing against the silence like a secret desperate to be spoken. My hand twitched against my knee, aching to reach for hers across the space, but something held me back. Respect. Fear. The fragile line we were already walking. She drew in a slow breath and finally gave me a smile, gentle, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Forget I said that, she murmured, lifting her mug again as though the conversation had never happened. But I couldn't forget. The air between us was charged, trembling with everything we hadn't dared to admit. And as I sat there watching the candlelight play across her face, I knew the unspoken truth, we were both holding back, but only just. The summer drew to a close faster than I wanted. My bag was packed by the door, and the train schedule folded neatly in my pocket, yet my chest felt heavy with everything I hadn't said. That final evening, I found myself once more on her porch. The garden glowed faintly under the moonlight, lavender and roses swaying in the soft night air. She walked me to the gate, her steps unhurried, as though drawing out every second. We didn't talk much at first. The silence felt too important, too fragile to disturb. Her hand brushed the wooden post as she paused, turning to look at me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For keeping me company this summer. For making me laugh again." Her voice carried a sincerity that rooted me in place. It wasn't just politeness, it was a confession of sorts, one wrapped in gentleness. I swallowed hard, searching for words, but none seemed right. Instead, I met her gaze, letting the silence speak. Her eyes shimmered faintly in the dim light, not from tears but from something deeper, a warmth, an ache, a longing carefully kept. She reached for my hand then. The movement was unhurried, almost tentative, but when her palm pressed against mine, the contact was firm, steady. Her skin was warm, grounding me in the moment. She didn't let go quickly, instead, her fingers curled softly around mine, holding longer than any neighbor ever should. I felt the weight of that gesture in every part of me. My heart thudded with the knowledge of what lingered between us, the quiet affection, the hesitation, the boundaries neither of us dared to cross. And yet, in that simple clasp of hands, everything was acknowledged. "I'll miss this," I admitted finally, my voice rougher than I intended. Her lips curved into a faint smile, one both tender and bittersweet. "So will I," she whispered. The night air stirred then, carrying the fragrance of her garden, wrapping around us like a secret. For a moment, I thought she might lean closer, thought I might close the distance myself. But instead, she squeezed my hand once more and released it slowly, as if letting go of something fragile she wished she could keep. I walked away with the echo of her touch still burning against my skin. And as I glanced back one last time, she was standing at the gate, framed by moonlight and shadows, watching quietly. Her words from the very first day returned to me, "You've got her spirit, you know." They lingered like a promise, like a flame I would carry with me long after the summer had ended.